Sword Art Online as a franchise is a Russian roulette of quality, and honestly, I love it for that. Each and every installment in the series is so wildly different from the last, to the point where the worst parts of SAO seem to enhance the experience of watching the show. That's not to say that some of SAO isn't really bad though, because it is. But the less appealing parts of the show make the rest of it shine all of the brighter. And I think that's why I enjoy the series as much as I do. It's fascinating to examine how the show fell from grace and how it managed to claw its way back up to some degree of prestige. And so since I think it'll be fun, and because I think it may actually impart some lessons on what to do and not to do when making a story, let's take a look back at the very first season of SAO and see how this infamous series got its start. Honestly, for all its flaws, this season has some joy to be found. Of course, I can't say all of it is earned, as I definitely assign a huge bit of nostalgia to this show, but some of Sword Art Online's best qualities are actually present in some parts of the show. Season 1 of SAO is split into two main storylines, or arcs, and both have different aspects I want to touch on. So let's go in order by starting with the first half. The first half of Sword Art Online Season 1, which is fondly referred to as the Aincrad arc for obvious reasons, still holds up pretty well in some places. The animation is nothing exceptional, but taking into account that this show was released almost 10 years ago now, it's nothing to scoff at. The fights are solidly done and the direction is nothing crazy, but still good, and the character and world design are pretty top notch, honestly. Also, I know that this is based on a light novel, so don't yell at me in the comments for applauding the anime for things that may be directly based on the source material. I'm just going to treat the anime as its own entity for simplicity's sake. Getting back into it, I want to take a moment to talk about the Aincrad arc's creativity in terms of its concepts, because I think this is one aspect of the show that's remained strong through the entire franchise. Mostly. Aincrad is, and I think always will be, stunning. The first episode of the show is such a strong one because it sets up this world so unbelievably well. The sweeping shots of the first floor that show off the gorgeous sky and insane landscape are just so captivating, and the announcement that Kaiba makes at the end of the first episode is what I think brings this show to life. The idea of people getting transported to a world as majestic and outlandish as Aincrad was such an insane concept, and at least in episode 1, the execution of this idea was genuinely solid. The first floor was unearthly and strange, and the video game concepts and ideas translated surprisingly well to a TV show. The juxtaposition of a massive world begging to be explored with the dread of knowing that death lurks at every corner is captivating. There's a reason that so many people fell in love with this show despite all of its flaws, and going into this series being aware of some of those flaws kinda lets you absorb all of the positive aspects of it a lot more. But that doesn't mean it's possible to ignore any of the Aincrad arc's many sins. And that brings us to what I think is the first lesson we can learn from this series: setting expectations. The audience's expectations are what allow you to craft a good story. The key to making an engaging show is in knowing exactly how to direct and guide the viewer from one plot point to the next. You don't want the audience to get too ahead of the story, because then it'll be boring and predictable, but you also don't want to structure the series in a way where the audience can never predict where the story is going. There are of course times where you may want to trick the audience or lull them into a false sense of security, but those situations are more rare as a general rule. In the case of Sword Art Online specifically, the show set an expectation and then proceeded to not meet that expectation even a little. The first episode sets the tone for the series and introduces us to the world. The first floor is big and a beacon for adventure, and we've kind of left the story on a bit of a cliffhanger, so it would make sense to follow up and to watch Kirito as he starts on the grind and see how life in this game could possibly work. Nope, it's time skip time. You'll be hearing that one a lot. It's episode 2 and we're still on the first floor, but now Kirito is alone and joining a group to clear the first boss of the game. No explanation for what the dungeon is, why this took so long, what Kirito's been up to. Just straight into it, I guess. The second episode is serviceable, if a little confusing. We still have no idea how a lot of the world works, because we skipped all of the world building that the first episode was clearly setting up, but at least we get some world building, a decent action scene, and some edgy character drama to savor. But then the second episode ends, and Kirito steps out onto the second floor, and it's like, heck yeah, time to explore the second floor and watch Kirito overcome some challenges, meet some new people, all kinds of good stuff. I'm excited, I'm ready, and then the episode hits and bam, there's another time skip. Suddenly, we're over a fourth of the way done with Aincrad, we still don't know how anything works, and the main characters that the previous episode set up are all nowhere to be seen, except fucking Klein, and no one cares about Klein, especially not this goddamn show. This is what I meant by poor management of expectations. This show doesn't have to adhere to conventional plot progression, but at least clue us into that at some point. The first 2 episodes are paced well enough, I guess, so where the hell did this come from? And even putting aside the pacing, we never really got to explore Aincrad the way we would have wanted to. Sword Art Online shows us this world and then rips it out from under us before we even have the chance to experience it. Every single locale we explore in the Aincrad arc feels like a Disneyland ride. They're all cobbled together in the story so strangely that everything feels disjointed and hollow. One moment we're in a generic town, and next we're in a snowy forest, and there's no sense of exploration or awe in any of it. And it doesn't help that the settings they chose are so boring. In the first episode, there's these elevated platforms that cover the land. The atmosphere and vibes feel so otherworldly, and you just want to understand this majestic place you found yourself in. But every episode past that just feels like so much less. A normal forest with snow in it. A flower garden. Mountain. Like, is this supposed to make me feel things besides disappointment? It just makes me think that they had this one really cool idea for the first floor, but then they just went, fuck it, let's just spend 3 episodes in a wood cabin next to a lake, because that's evidently what the audience wants to see. Last thing for Aincrad, let's talk a bit about the characters. SAO has never had amazing characters, except for maybe a bit of Alicization in the reboot. I've never found any particular enjoyment in the personalities SAO has to offer. And Aincrad is the origin of all of this mediocrity. The first half of this arc has the main character speeding through multiple different love interests before dropping them all in favor of Asuna. Many people say that Asuna is best girl, which is an opinion that is about as correct as it is boring. Sure, Asuna may be the best character in the show, but does that really mean much when this is her competition? Anyways, none of the many side characters in this season really offer anything beyond their first impressions, so I'm just gonna gloss over them for now in favor of talking about the main characters, for whatever that's worth. Kirito is basically just a white knight, somebody who acts in the best interests of every female around him. Except the show didn't want to make it too obvious that Kirito was a white knight, so they instead made him edgy and emo and called him the Black Swordsman. This is the depth of this story's writing. So Kirito honestly makes no sense in a lot of this season. He has so many pseudo-character arcs and strange out-of-character moments that I honestly don't even know where to start with him. At some point I want to write a full character analysis on this man, but that's a video for a different day. Past that, as I said before, Asuna is one of the more acceptable characters in the season, but also one of the most boring. They have a pretty elementary sense of justice, no interesting motivations to speak of, and they fall in love with Kirito for seemingly no reason. And all of this just works together to make a very unremarkable character. While I seriously don't understand the chemistry between Kirito and Asuna, I will say that the moments they share together aren't awfully done. The writing for these scenes are passable enough to be entertaining in some ways, and they stand out in comparison to a lot of the other scenes in the show. I think this is the reason so many people enjoy Kirito and Asuna's relationship despite all of its problems. The two play off each other in entertaining enough ways, which makes these moments stand out. Even still, these moments are kind of dulled by the show's incomprehensible pacing and lack of creativity in terms of their characters. Also, Kaiba just straight up makes no sense, and that genuinely upsets me. The entire show builds Kaiba up to be this madman, a lunatic that imprisoned thousands of people in his game, resulting in the death of most of the players. It's a truly monstrous act, especially when you consider that this game would target younger individuals, maybe even teenagers. Yet one thing the show doesn't stop to do is really let you feel the impact of this. We never truly get a grasp of the situation's effects on the real world. We never stop to examine how this must be impacting different people's lives. On paper, we can see how awful of a situation this is, but the show never lets us feel it. Kirito, as a certified pro gamer, doesn't show much emotion in being trapped in this game, or if he does, we at least don't get to see it. The pacing of the show doesn't allow us to get invested, and the characters don't let us feel their struggles. Even still, Kaiba is the villain of the show, and that's something that won't change no matter how lightly the show treats his actions. And through the entire run of the Aincrad arc, we wonder what could have possibly caused Kaiba to do something so evil. And finally, at the end of it, we stand with the main characters face to face with the mastermind behind the entire thing. And then, nothing. Kaiba barely even attempts to explain himself. Kirito and Asuna don't seek to condemn him for his actions. There's just nothing. Kaiba talks as if he is completely sane, yet he doesn't seem to regret his actions, and he doesn't seem to have gained anything from it all either. He talks about how he wanted to create a perfect world for himself and everyone else, yet he doesn't explain why his perfect world was worth so much death and despair. And even more confusingly, Kaiba acts as almost an ally to Kirito and his friends in the future, as if his actions are in some way excusable. In a story, when someone commits acts of cruelty, there is a great opportunity to build out their character. Cruelty often reveals more about the perpetrator than the victim, so taking this heinous act and using it to build some personality or motivation for Kaiba would have been perfect. Yet his actions are barely rationalized, his motivations aren't given weight, his personal desires are used to justify the massive loss of life when they have no right to be. If we got a chance to see Kaiba's past, or if we got to understand what pushed him to want to escape reality in such a way, maybe that could have done something for his character. But as it stands, Kaiba is one of the most disappointing aspects of this season. Finally, some smaller nitpicks before we wrap this section up. The Aincrad arc has a lot of fan service, and for any of you who don't know, this is a trend for the series. It's not unforgivable in the grand scheme of things, but it sure doesn't make for a fun watching experience. Next, the ending for this half of the season is complete BS. Like, I genuinely have no idea how the writers managed to twist the story in such a way that this was the ending that we got. It's unsatisfying, it feels rushed and confusing, and it just overall leaves a bad taste in your mouth. Alright, that was the Aincrad arc. Overall, this wasn't the worst thing in the world, but it definitely had its flaws, and a lot of them. I think the biggest trend with early SAO is that this series has a lot of awesome ideas, but doesn't quite have the ability to deliver on them. Most of the show is really unique, and you can see the intentions behind it all, but it never manages to follow up on those intentions in a satisfying way. The premise of the Aincrad arc is amazing, and I think the fact that it's being rebooted so successfully speaks to the quality of its ideas. But past the initial hook, almost every aspect of the show is lacking in some way. Without the first few episodes, this would be a pretty trashy series with some promise in certain areas, but with the expectations set up at the start of the Aincrad arc, the rest of the show feels uninspired and lackluster. And now, we move on to the big one, the second half of Sword Art Online Season 1, also known as the Fairy Dance arc. Honestly though, I'm just gonna call it the Alfheim arc, it rolls off the tongue easier. If you haven't seen SAO and are still watching for some reason, first off, thanks. But more importantly, Alfheim is the standard for bad SAO. The story makes the Aincrad arc seem like a 10 out of 10 in comparison. Almost every single problem I brought up earlier is still in play in this season, and none of the positives I mentioned before are anywhere to be found. With that in mind, let's dive right into this before you have the chance to regret it. For the last section, I tried to start things off by talking about some of the better aspects of that half of the show, and for this section, I'll be honest, I tried to do that too. But let me tell you, there's not much here. I don't know, the driving conflict is kinda unique. Instead of the main character being in any sort of danger, Asuna and some other SAO players are stuck in another game called ALO. In this new game, they're being experimented on to develop ways to control their thoughts and feelings. That's kinda neat. Except, how did the main villain, Sugo, manage to steal the consciousness of these players and put them into his own game between the time that Kirito cleared the game and freed these players and when the players all woke up? Sugo says that he adjusted the routers to grab a few players and shove them into his own game, but that makes even less sense. Among many technical problems with this explanation, how did Sugo prepare for all the players to log out at this very moment? Logging out of SAO is a near instant process, as shown by Klein logging out minutes before his pizza shows up and still being confident he'll be able to receive it. Furthermore, this makes sense because why the hell would anyone buy this game otherwise? Anyways, as we know, Kirito ends the game a decent bit before it was supposed to end by challenging Kaiba and beating him, so how the heck was Sugo ready and able to swipe the minds of a couple hundred players? Also, how did he steal these players' minds without anyone, say, tracing the connection and seeing who owns the server the players are connected to? Furthermore, what the f do you mean adjusting the routers? Do you know what a router is? See, this is what I'm talking about. I try to be positive for one damn moment and it all just goes to crap. The world of Alfheim Online is bland as all heck. It has none of the initial charm that Aincrad did and is somehow executed just as poorly. It feels like a normal fantasy world you'd find in any isekai nowadays, and honestly, that's just a shame. For as much as I try to view this half of the season in its own little bubble, it's hard to not dream of what could be. This arc took up half the season and has none of the charm that the first half did. The premise is slightly nonsensical, it has lower stakes than last time, and it just feels like less thought was put into it. I would have killed to see them lean more into the whole mind control plot point. The idea of controlling someone's thoughts and feelings through a VR headset and trapping them inside a virtual world is honestly kind of interesting, because as we already know from the Aincrad arc, the Nerve Gear, the VR headset, is capable of making people feel things that aren't real. That's how people in the game could taste, touch, and experience the world to the extent that they could. Kaiba was the one who initially developed this, but his use of it was just to make the world more real to the players. And it makes sense that this is what Kaiba used it for, but logically there's so many different ways that this technology could be used. Seeing it developed into something more malicious by someone with bad intentions could have been kinda compelling, especially if this technology was, say, used on someone from the main cast. But this entire plot point feels just like background noise. The reason Kirito is trying to take down Sugo is basically just because he has Asuna captive, which is fair, but it makes the whole mind control plot point a lot less of a focus. Even in the climax, it's just Asuna trying to save Asuna. Kirito trying to save Asuna and Sugo trying to keep Asuna captive, and it's really just not much more three-dimensional than that. And speaking of that climax, What the f, SAO? Even for all the fan service, this show is pretty vanilla most of the time, which just makes this messed up NTR sexual assault by the villain on a literal teenager just all the more shocking and uncomfortable. It does make me hate the villain, like terribly, so if that was really the only intention with that scene, mission accomplished I guess, but it also just makes me hate the show and everyone involved in it for making me watch this. The tone, the build-up, just nothing prepares you for this. It honestly feels like the writers suddenly realized that this villain was boring and not an obstacle in the slightest, and instead of making him more interesting or compelling or anything really, they just decided to include this last-minute BS. It's a scene that works purely on shock factor, it has no impact aside from being unsettling, and it has no lasting consequences and is never even important to anything later in the show. It's just the creme de la creme of bad storytelling. So just to recap, this arc has barely any of the charm of the original Aincrad arc, is executed just as badly if not worse than the episodes that came before it, and has a demonstrably unsettling ending. Is it possible to get better from there? Nope. In fact, it only gets worse. So the Alfheim arc is known for two main things in the SAO fandom. The final scene with Sugo that I just talked about, and incest. Yep, you heard me right. So the Aincrad arc has this thing where in the first few episodes of the show, Kirito bounces around and goes questing with a couple different characters, pretty much all of which who end up developing some form of feelings for him by the end of their journeys. These characters are all abandoned by the show sooner rather than later as Kirito falls for Asuna, but these characters still follow Kirito around in the later seasons as friends. I put friends in quotes there because these characters are often still written to show some semblance of romantic interest in Kirito despite his relationship with Asuna. This pseudo-harem aspect of SAO is one of its most prominent and most criticized aspects, and for good reason too. It's become somewhat of a joke how much of a lady killer Kirito is despite still being Kirito. Anyway, in the Aincrad arc, this trope of SAO was definitely weird, but the story never lingered on these moments long enough for them to become real problems. But in the Alfheim arc, that changed for the worse with the inclusion of Kirito's cousin turned adoptive sister, Suguha. Suguha is Kirito's main companion through the Alfheim arc and is also head over heels in love with him. I hated saying that. And for the second time in the span of about 2 minutes, I have to ask, what the f*** SAO? I understand the need to constantly and incessantly add love interest into Kirito's life. It's something that's carried through into even the best seasons of the show, but why do they have to be blood related? And also, how unbelievably stupid is this whole setup? So Kirito ventures into this game to save Asuna and meets Leafa, his sister's in-game avatar. The two play together and try to get to the place where Asuna is being kept. And throughout this, neither of them realize who the other person is. This is then rendered even more ridiculous when we realize that Suguha has a crush on Kirito's in-game avatar, likely for the same reasons she fell in love with Kirito in the real world. The focal point of this arc is supposed to be on Kirito being willing to do anything to save Asuna. So why muddle that single character trait by throwing another love interest who happens to also be his adoptive sister into the mix? This arc had one goal, and it couldn't even find a secondary story that could complement that. And the conclusion to this major storyline, which I don't even think should be a storyline, is just the most nonsensical thing. I hesitate to even call it a conclusion. And Suguha and Kirito don't even have any interesting chemistry or dynamics to speak of. If you're gonna make the main characters of this arc siblings who don't realize that they're siblings somehow, at least play into that. Kirito and Suguha are siblings in the real world, but they're slightly estranged because of their pasts and because of the entire SAO incident where Kirito was unconscious for 2 years. If the story played into that further and made it so that Kirito and Suguha struggled to interact normally in the real world, that could have made for a far more interesting story. In this theoretical story, Kirito and Suguha could have built up a non-romantic relationship with each other in the game, enjoying each other's presence because it reminded them of their sibling bond in the past. So then, when they realized each other's true identity, it would have allowed them to reconnect as siblings in the real world too. It would still be exceptionally strange that they couldn't tell who the other person was in the game, but at least this story would have been a lot more heartfelt and genuine. This would have also been a lot more consistent with Kirito's character arc throughout the story. Kirito is someone who's always run away to video games to escape the real world, but this time venturing into a game allowed him to not only save someone he loved, but also to reconnect with a major part of his life. Anyway, I won't bore you with any more details of what could have been. The secondary story we were given in the series is a major letdown and a distraction from the main story, as lackluster as that also is. So that was the Alfheim arc. Sorry if this was just a large train of negativity, but most of this arc was either poorly done or just not that interesting to talk about. Even the most acceptable parts of this arc ooze mediocrity, and the worst parts of the show are just disturbing and hard to watch. Overall, I think I would give this section of the show a 4 out of 10. While there are some outstandingly bad portions of it, most of it is just inoffensive, so I can't really mark it down any further than I already did. But in general, I just don't see any reason to watch this. If you really want to, then I guess you can go ahead, but while I'm rewatching this show for fun, I usually skip past this arc and jump from the 15th episode straight to the last episode of season 1. It honestly works out just fine that way and you don't really miss out on that much. But at the very least, this is as bad as it gets. This is the worst that mainline SAO has ever been, and it's going to be a steady uphill curve from now on. So at least that's something to look forward to. So I originally wanted to make a massive video on every mainline SAO property, but I realized that video would likely come out to be almost 2 hours long, so I'm going to try and segment this video into 4 parts. This video covers the Alfheim and Aincrad arcs, the next one will cover the Phantom Bullet arc and the Mother's Rosario arcs, then there will be a video on the First Sword Art Online movie, Ordinal Scale, followed by a video on the entire Alicization arc. I won't be making a video on the Progressive movie since I already kinda made one, so that'll probably just be the end of it there. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to subscribe so you'll know when the rest of this massive review is coming out. But until then, thanks for watching and I'll see you guys later. Bye!